In today's episode, we're diving into some of the most horrifying snake attacks ever recorded in history. From a retired farmer who treated a deadly bushmaster like a harmless pet, to a software engineer whose illegal collection of exotic snakes triggered a fatal chain of events. It was April 10, 2010, on the quiet outskirts of Brownsville, Texas, where the Rio Grande's backwaters met dense mesquite and palm. The humid air reeked of wet soil, and something massive waited silently in the brush. The small local nature park was known for its exotic reptile shows, a mix of native species and non-native rescues confiscated from the illegal pet trade. It wasn't a big-budget tourist attraction, but it had a loyal following among locals and curious travelers passing through. Families came for the turtles and harmless corn snakes. School groups visited to learn about conservation, but the star attraction was the park's prized Burmese python, a reptile unlike anything most visitors had ever seen. This python was a giant, nearly 18 feet long, weighing over 150 pounds, with scales patterned in gold, black, and olive that shimmered under the sunlight filtering through the pavilion roof. It had been rescued years earlier from a private owner who had purchased it as a hatchling, not realizing just how quickly it would grow into a predator capable of overpowering almost anything it could wrap itself around. Now, it lived in a large, reinforced enclosure, fed on a controlled diet, and handled only by experienced staff. At the center of it all stood Daniel Harris, a 41-year-old wildlife handler with over a decade of experience. Calm, charismatic, and comfortable in front of an audience, Daniel had performed this routine dozens of times. He had an easy smile, a practiced patter, and the kind of confidence that made people trust him, even with a predator just feet away. The demonstration began as it always did. Daniel spoke about the python's origins in Southeast Asia, how it had been introduced to the United States through the pet trade, and why it had become one of the most notorious invasive species in Florida's wetlands. For emphasis, he knelt beside it, sliding his hands beneath one of its coils to show the density of the muscle. The snake lay still, tongue flicking lazily in and out, its head resting motionless on the platform. Daniel turned back to the crowd, answering a child's question about its diet, explaining how pythons can go weeks, even months, without eating after a large meal. Then, in less than a heartbeat, the stillness shattered. The python's head shot forward with blinding speed, striking Daniel's side. The movement was so fast that many in the audience didn't register what had happened until they saw the coils whip around his torso like thick, living ropes. His breath caught in a sharp gasp. The first constriction forced the air from his lungs in a wheeze. The second crushed ribs with an audible crack. The third began to collapse his chest cavity entirely. Gasps and screams erupted from the audience. At first, a few thought it might be part of the show, until they saw Daniel's face flush deep red, his eyes wide with panic. His arms strained to push the coils away, but the snake had already locked them to his sides, the muscles beneath its patterned skin rippling with terrible efficiency. Two staff members rushed forward with metal poles, trying to wedge them between the coils and Daniel's body. One grabbed the snake's head, attempting to control it, but the python twisted violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. Another staffer shouted for the tranquilizer kit, his voice tight with urgency. Daniel's knees buckled. The python adjusted its grip with surgical precision, shifting its coils to sink deeper into his body. Another sharp crack echoed through the pavilion. His breathing grew ragged, his movements weaker with each passing second. Finally, a tranquilizer dart found its mark. The python's body rippled as the drug began to take effect. Its grip loosened slightly, just enough for rescuers to pry Daniel free and drag him onto the floor. He collapsed, motionless, his chest heaving in shallow gasps. Paramedics arrived within minutes to find Daniel with fractured ribs, collapsed lungs, and coil-shaped bruises. He was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery to repair the internal damage. He spent weeks in intensive care, haunted by nightmares of the crushing weight and breaking ribs. The python was placed under stricter protocols, and its public shows were canceled indefinitely. Daniel's family later released a short statement thanking the medical team and park staff for saving his life. They acknowledged that he had taken a calculated risk, one that nearly killed him, and that the incident had likely ended his career working with large constrictors. The Brownsville attack was a harsh reminder that even a lifetime of experience can be undone in seconds. It was September 21st, 2014, in rural Queensland, Australia. The evening was humid and it had rained earlier. Storm clouds were overhead. From the farmhouse, the property looked calm. But on one edge of the land, something dangerous was about to happen. Luke McAdams was 29 years old and had worked as a farmhand on his family's property for most of his life. He lived with his partner and was responsible for taking care of the fields, livestock, and buildings. Beyond farm work, he was interested in snakes, especially pythons, which he kept in a small area near the edge of the property. Recently, he had gotten a 12-foot carpet python, which was unusually large even for that type of snake. Luke had spent weeks getting it used to its new home, feeding it and watching its behavior. He thought he could handle it safely. Though he had some experience, he sometimes took unnecessary risks, including checking on the snakes at night when it was hard to see. That night, Luke wanted to check on his snakes before the rain came back. He had already noticed minor scratches on his arms from handling the python earlier in the week, but he thought they were no big deal. His partner had told him to secure the enclosures properly and suggested waiting until daylight. But Luke ignored the advice. He wanted to make sure the snakes were fed and accounted for. He underestimated how stormy conditions could make the ground slippery and make it harder to access the outdoor pens. The enclosure area was an open space with a dirt floor that was muddy from earlier rain. The fence was low and reinforced with wire mesh. Each tank and pen had branches, rocks, and hiding spots for the snakes, but space was cramped and crowded. Light rain was falling, making surfaces slippery under the dim outdoor lights. The 12-foot carpet python's pen had a metal latch that was slightly bent from previous use. Its grip was weakened just enough that a moment of not paying attention could allow the snake to escape. Carpet pythons are non-venomous constrictors that can subdue prey by wrapping their muscular bodies around it. A large python of this size can immobilize an adult human over several minutes, gradually increasing pressure with each coil. Usually they avoid confrontation, biting only defensively, and constriction becomes effective slowly rather than instantly. Wrong moves, loud movements, or startled reactions can cause defensive strikes from even well-adjusted snakes. Earlier that evening, neighbors had seen Luke moving between pens in the dark. They saw him lean over the large python's enclosure and occasionally inspect the latches. Stormy weather made the ground slippery, limiting safe footing. The latch on the python's enclosure was slightly bent and loose, enough that a startled snake could push it open, though Luke did not notice the problem. At around 9 p.m., Luke bent down to check the python's water dish. His foot slipped in the mud, causing him to stumble forward. The slight movement was enough to startle the python. It slipped past the weakened latch and rose from the pen with a low hiss, initially coiling around his lower legs. Luke tried to step back, but the wet ground made him slip, and the snake tightened gradually as he struggled. The neighbors, watching from their farmhouse a few hundred feet away, could make out Luke's shape moving strangely and heard muffled calls, but the low light and distance prevented them from seeing any details of the struggle. The python gradually moved higher as Luke struggled, restricting his arm movements and compressing his chest over several minutes. Mud splashed, branches rustled, and his flashlight fell to the ground. The snake's actions were deliberate and defensive, responding to sudden motion and noise, not hunting. Slowly, Luke found it harder to breathe and move, the constrictor's strength increasing with each coil. By the time his partner reached the enclosure with a flashlight and shouted for help, Luke was completely unable to move. Attempts to manually pull the python off without proper tools were dangerous and often caused the snake to tighten its grip further. The snake remained coiled defensively around him. Emergency animal authorities were called, and when they arrived, they killed the python to safely recover his body. The scene showed the python's coils had wrapped progressively, with the ground churned in mud and water. Minor scratches on his arms and legs matched prior handling incidents, and disturbed plants showed the struggle had been real and went on for a while. The aftermath led to the temporary closure of the property's snake collection. Inspectors documented all enclosures, latches, and pens. Recommendations were made for secure containment, nighttime handling precautions, and additional training for anyone working with large constrictors. It was May 17, 2018, and the rural construction site in Georgia buzzed with activity as heavy equipment cleared forested land for a new subdivision development. Tommy Rodriguez operated his bulldozer with practiced skill, pushing aside trees and brush to make way for the planned homes. The 26-year-old heavy equipment operator had been working construction for 8 years, but he had no training in wildlife encounters despite working in areas where dangerous animals were common. Tommy was known among his co-workers for his fearless attitude and willingness to handle situations that other workers avoided. He was supporting his pregnant wife and was eager to impress his supervisors to secure a promotion that would provide better benefits for his growing family. The construction site was clearing habitat that had been home to various wildlife species, displacing animals and forcing them into contact with human activity. The forested area being developed had been undisturbed for decades, providing ideal habitat for various snake species, including some of the most venomous in North America. The construction activity was destroying dens and hiding places, forcing snakes into the open, where encounters with workers became inevitable. Company safety protocols required workers to report wildlife sightings to supervisors, but these rules were often ignored in the rush to complete projects on schedule. Eastern coral snakes are among the most venomous species in North America, possessing a potent neurotoxic venom that attacks the nervous system and causes respiratory paralysis. They are secretive snakes that spend most of their time underground or hidden beneath logs and debris, making encounters with humans relatively rare. Coral snakes are often confused with harmless species, leading to dangerous misidentifications. Their venom contains powerful neurotoxins that cause progressive muscle paralysis, making immediate medical treatment essential for survival. Tommy was clearing brush with his bulldozer when the machine's blade uncovered what appeared to be multiple snakes sheltering independently under debris beneath a fallen log. Several snakes scattered as their hiding place was destroyed, but one coral snake appeared to be severely injured from the encounter with the heavy machinery. Tommy shut down his bulldozer to investigate, curious about the colorful snake he had uncovered. The coral snake lay motionless among the debris, its distinctive red, yellow, and black banding clearly visible in the afternoon sunlight. Tommy assumed the snake was dead, killed by his bulldozer during the clearing operation. He decided to pick up the snake to show his co-workers, thinking it would make an interesting conversation piece during their lunch break. Tommy reached down and grasped the coral snake with his bare hands, not realizing that the snake was only stunned and disoriented from its encounter with the bulldozer. The moment Tommy's hand made contact, the coral snake bit him on the palm, chewing for several seconds before its small fangs penetrated the skin and injected a dose of potent neurotoxic venom. Tommy dropped the snake and examined the small puncture wounds on his palm, initially dismissing the bite as minor due to the snake's small size. His co-workers gathered around as Tommy explained what had happened, but none of them recognized the serious nature of a coral snake envenomation. The rural construction site was 35 minutes from the nearest hospital, and the delay in seeking medical treatment would prove fatal. Tommy's co-workers called 911, but the remote location of the construction site delayed the arrival of emergency medical personnel. Initially, Tommy experienced only mild symptoms and continued working, believing the bite was harmless due to the snake's small size. Several hours after the bite, the coral snake venom began its deadly progression through Tommy's system. The neurotoxic poison attacked his respiratory muscles, making breathing increasingly difficult. Tommy's speech became slurred as the neurotoxins affected his neuromuscular function, and his vision became blurred. By the time paramedics arrived, Tommy was experiencing severe respiratory distress. Tommy was transported to the rural hospital, but the facility had delayed recognition of the situation, delaying his need for intubation. Without access to mechanical ventilation to assist his breathing, Tommy's condition rapidly deteriorated as the coral snake venom caused progressive respiratory muscle paralysis. Tommy died from prolonged hypoxia due to untreated respiratory paralysis, as the coral snake venom caused complete paralysis of his breathing muscles. The neurotoxic poison had specifically targeted his respiratory system, making it impossible for his body to maintain adequate breathing. The small size of the coral snake had deceived Tommy into thinking the bite was harmless, but the potent venom had proved fatal despite the snake's diminutive appearance. The investigation revealed that Tommy had violated company safety protocols by handling wildlife without proper training or equipment. His death devastated his pregnant wife and led to mandatory wildlife safety training for all construction crews working in areas where venomous snakes were present. The incident highlighted the hidden dangers faced by workers in industries that disturb natural habitats. Tommy's tragic encounter with an eastern coral snake became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper wildlife training for construction workers. His death left behind a widow and unborn child, serving as a stark reminder that even small snakes can be deadly when not treated with proper respect. It was April 7th, 2015, and the afternoon heat in suburban Toowoomba, Queensland, hung thick and still as Evan Alquist unlocked the garden shed behind his parents' weatherboard home, unaware that his 2-year experiment in backyard snake breeding was about to end with a fatal eastern brown snake envenomation. Evan Alquist was an 18-year-old unemployed high school graduate who had spent the last 2 years transforming his parents' garden shed into an unlicensed reptile breeding operation. He had started at 16 after binge-watching snake handling videos online, convinced that the professional breeders he admired had no special training he couldn't replicate on his own. His parents, busy with their own lives and largely absent during the day, had dismissed his hobby as a phase. Evan's reputation among his small circle of friends was that of someone who took unnecessary risks for attention. He regularly posted videos of himself free-handling venomous snakes, his bare hands gripping scaled bodies just behind their heads, about to end with a fatal eastern brown snake envenomation, the result of 2 years of unchecked confidence built on online misinformation. His goal that autumn was simple: expand his collection and eventually sell offspring to other enthusiasts through online forums. He had acquired several species without permits, keeping them in cheap plastic storage tubs, stacked haphazardly on metal shelving. Among his collection was a large adult eastern brown, likely over 5 feet, that he had purchased from a questionable source 3 months earlier. Friends who visited the shed had warned him repeatedly that he was pushing his luck, especially with the brown snake, which had grown increasingly aggressive during feeding times. Evan dismissed their concerns with the same confidence that had carried him through dozens of handling sessions without incident. The eastern brown snake is the second most venomous land snake in the world, capable of delivering a venom dose sufficient to cause fatal systemic envenomation in multiple adult humans. These snakes can grow up to 7 feet long and are notoriously fast and aggressive when threatened, capable of striking multiple times in rapid succession. Their venom contains potent procoagulant toxins and cardiotoxic components that cause rapid clotting factor consumption, internal bleeding, hypotension, and cardiovascular collapse, rather than prominent localized tissue destruction. Unlike some venomous species that deliver dry bites as warnings, eastern brown snakes typically inject significant amounts of venom with each strike. They are responsible for more deaths in Australia than any other snake species, and experts universally recommend never handling them without proper equipment, training, and immediate access to antivenom. That Tuesday afternoon, Evan had decided to transfer the brown snake to a larger enclosure. He worked alone, as he usually did, with his phone propped on a shelf to record the process for his social media followers. The shed's single window provided minimal ventilation, and the temperature inside had climbed past 90 degrees. Evan removed the lid from the plastic tub, and the snake immediately raised the front third of its body in a defensive S-curve. A clear warning signal he either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. He reached in bare-handed, attempting to grasp the snake behind its head, but his palm slipped on the smooth scales. The snake recoiled and struck at his hand, missing by inches. Evan jerked backward, knocking over an empty tub, and the noise agitated the snake further. It coiled tightly, its head tracking his movements with predatory focus. Evan muttered something inaudible on the recovered video footage and reached in again, this time trying to pin the snake's head with one hand while scooping its body with the other. The technique was clumsy and poorly executed. The next strike came without warning, the snake's head snapping forward with mechanical precision. Both fangs punctured Evan's right forearm, sinking deep into the muscle. He screamed and instinctively shook his arm violently, a reaction that increased venom dispersion through muscle movement and circulation. As he tried to pull away, the snake struck again, this time hitting his wrist. The fangs held for a fraction of a second before Evan finally wrenched his arm free, stumbling backward into the shelving unit. The pain was immediate and intense, radiating up his arm like fire spreading through dry brush. Evan clutched his forearm, blood seeping from 2 distinct puncture wounds, with limited local swelling and early bruising. He staggered towards the shed door, his phone forgotten, and still recording the empty space where he had stood. The snake, now free, slithered across the concrete floor toward a gap in the wallboards. Evan made it approximately 15 feet into the backyard before the venom's systemic effects took hold. His legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees in the patchy grass, vomiting violently. The venom's procoagulant effects rapidly consumed clotting factors, leading to internal bleeding and falling blood pressure, while hypoxia set in as circulation collapsed, rather than purely localized injury. He tried to call out, but managed only a strangled gasp. Bleeding from the bite sites, minor gum oozing and pallor were visible signs of systemic failure. He developed sudden collapse marked by profound weakness, confusion, and involuntary muscle twitching, as severe coagulopathy and hypotension disrupted cerebral perfusion. His breathing became increasingly labored as shock and cardiovascular collapse impaired oxygen delivery. He collapsed face down in the grass, still conscious but barely able to move. The entire sequence from bite to cardiovascular collapse had taken approximately 12 minutes, consistent with documented eastern brown envenomation cases. Evan's mother arrived home at 3:47 p.m. and found him lying motionless in the yard, with moderate arm swelling and clear signs of shock and collapse, his face pale. She called emergency services immediately, her screams audible to neighbors who later gave statements to police. Paramedics arrived 14 minutes after her call, and Evan showed severe signs of envenomation and shock. They initiated aggressive supportive care, airway management, oxygen, intravenous fluids, airway support, and advanced life support measures, but did not administer antivenom in the field. Antivenom was prepared and administered upon arrival at Toowoomba Hospital, but he was pronounced dead shortly afterward at 4:23 p.m. The attending physician noted that even when antivenom was administered promptly on arrival, The extent of systemic envenomation and delay from the initial bites made reversal unlikely. Police seized the remaining snakes from the shed, including 6 venomous species kept without permits. The escaped brown snake was never recovered, prompting a brief neighborhood alert. Local news ran a cautionary story about the dangers of unlicensed reptile keeping, but it generated little attention beyond Toowoomba. No criminal charges were filed, as Evan had been an adult at 18, and the only victim of his own negligence. His parents, devastated and unable to remain in the house where their son had died, quietly sold the property 4 months later and moved interstate. The shed was demolished by the new owners. It was August 19, 2015, when Ramesh Patil rose before dawn in the village of Kanapur, Maharashtra. The monsoon season had reached its peak, flooding rice paddies to knee-depth across the low-lying farmland. Heavy rains over the previous 3 days had displaced wildlife, pushing snakes into agricultural areas where small patches of higher ground offered the only refuge above the waterline. Ramesh was 34 years old, working a 3-acre rice plot inherited from his father. The land provided subsistence living for his wife, 4 children aged 3 through 12, and his elderly mother, all of whom shared a single-room home at the edge of the village. The household survived on approximately $700 annually, relying almost entirely on the success of the rice harvest and occasional seasonal labor. His field lay 1.5 miles from the village center, connected by a narrow dirt path that became slick and uneven during monsoon months. That morning began at 4:45 a.m. Ramesh drank chai quickly and departed at 5:10 a.m., carrying his curved sickle and a small cloth for wiping sweat and rainwater from his hands. The rice plants stood approximately 4 feet tall, heavy with developing grain that bent the stalks low over the flooded rows. Weather forecasts predicted additional afternoon storms, making early morning work essential before rising winds flattened the crop. He wore thin cotton clothing and no footwear, the standard practice for subsistence farmers in the region, allowing better footing in mud and water. Ramesh entered the field from the southwest corner, wading into knee-deep brown water. He began cutting rice stalks methodically, bundling them by hand and stacking them on narrow ridges between rows. Visibility through the dense vegetation remained limited to only a few feet, with submerged ground features impossible to distinguish beneath the surface. Russell's vipers are among Asia's most dangerous snakes, responsible for thousands of envenomations each year across the Indian subcontinent. Adults typically measure 3 to 5 feet in length, with thick bodies patterned in bold geometric markings that provide effective camouflage among mud, straw, and decaying vegetation. Their venom is primarily hemotoxic, disrupting blood clotting and damaging blood vessels, leading to progressive bleeding and systemic complications. Encounters increase sharply during monsoon season, when flooding drives vipers into cultivated fields and forces farmers to work barefoot in reduced visibility. The viper had taken refuge on a small elevated mud mound between 2 rice rows, just high enough to remain above the floodwater. Its brown and tan pattern blended into the surrounding debris. At approximately 6:25 a.m., Ramesh's cutting path brought him directly into the row where the snake rested. His left foot came down onto the viper's mid-body. The defensive strike followed immediately, fangs driving into the outer portion of his left ankle. The bite resulted in clear envenomation before the snake released and disappeared into the flooded field. 2 puncture wounds were visible just above the ankle bone, blood welling around them. Intense burning pain radiated from the bite site almost immediately. Within minutes, swelling became apparent, the skin around the ankle tightening as fluid accumulated. As time passed, darkening of the skin developed gradually as bruising spread outward from the wound. Ramesh dropped his sickle and began moving toward the village. Progress was slow along the muddy path, each step sending pain up his leg as swelling increased and stiffness set in. By the time he had covered most of the distance back, more than 30 minutes had passed since the bite. His pace reduced to short, uneven steps. As the effects of the venom progressed, additional symptoms became evident. Nausea set in, followed by repeated vomiting along the path. Blood began appearing along his gums and at his nose as clotting failed, leaving visible streaks on his clothing and hands. His vision blurred intermittently, and physical weakness became increasingly apparent as he struggled to maintain balance. Near the edge of the village path, less than an hour after the bite, his movements became unsteady. He took several steps before collapsing face forward into the mud. Blood continued seeping from his nose and mouth. His breathing became rapid and shallow as strength failed, and he remained where he fell. When Ramesh did not return by sunrise, his son Vikram was sent to look for him at approximately 7:30 a.m. Vikram found his father lying motionless along the path and ran back to the village for help. Several farmers responded, but no one in Kanapur owned a vehicle. A runner was dispatched to a larger village 2 miles away. Approximately 40 minutes passed before a motorcycle arrived. The journey to the hospital covered 35 miles over wet, uneven roads, taking more than 90 minutes. Ramesh Patil died shortly before arrival. His death reflected a pattern repeated across rural India each year, where delayed access to medical care and venom-induced bleeding make Russell's viper bites especially dangerous during monsoon season. It was September 22, 2016, in Brazoria County, Texas. The property was a 40-acre cattle ranch with several outbuildings, including a large wooden barn that hadn't been used for storage in over 2 years. Brock Tillman was 41 years old, owner of a small pest control business he'd operated for 9 years. He primarily handled rodent and insect problems for rural properties in the area. The ranch owner had called him about a rat problem in the barn, mentioning that cattle feed stored there months ago had attracted them. Brock arrived alone at 2:15 p.m. in his work truck. He carried a flashlight, inspection mirror, and a duffel bag containing traps and bait stations. As Brock approached the barn, he noticed several shed snake skins near the entrance, draped over old equipment. The skins were relatively fresh and intact, measuring approximately 4 to 5 feet in length. The ranch owner mentioned he'd seen a large snake near the barn twice in the past month, but hadn't been able to identify it. Brock explained that snakes were common in barns due to rodent activity and typically avoided confrontation. Inside the barn, Brock found extensive evidence of rodent activity: droppings, gnawed wood, and scattered feed remnants. He also noticed more snake sign, shed skin fragments, and tracks in the dust near a pile of old tarps. As he moved deeper into the barn, he heard faint rustling sounds coming from behind a stack of wooden pallets in the corner. He assumed it was rats and decided to set traps in that area first. Monocled cobras, occasionally found in Texas due to the exotic pet trade and occasional escapes or releases, average 4 to 5 feet in length. They possess potent neurotoxic venom that affects the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure by blocking nerve signals to muscles, particularly those controlling breathing. Monocled cobras are highly defensive and will readily display their characteristic hood and strike when threatened. Brock crouched near the pallets, about 6 feet from the rustling sounds. He set his duffel bag down and pulled out several snap traps. As he reached forward to place a trap behind the bottom pallet, his hand came within 2 feet of the coiled cobra. The snake immediately raised its head and flared its hood. Startled, Brock jerked his hand back, dropping the trap. The cobra rose higher, hood fully extended. Brock began to stand and step backward but turned quickly, disoriented by the sudden threat. His heel caught on the duffel bag, and he fell backward onto the barn floor. The cobra struck rapidly. First, it bit Brock's right calf, fangs penetrating through his pant leg into the muscle, then released immediately. As Brock tried to push himself away, it struck again, catching his right hand. Finally, as he scrambled toward the barn entrance, the cobra delivered a brief secondary strike to his right forearm before withdrawing. The ranch owner, working 400 yards away, did not hear anything unusual. Brock sustained 3 bite wounds: right calf, right hand, and right forearm. Swelling and discoloration spread quickly. He crawled toward the barn entrance, increasingly uncoordinated as the venom began affecting his respiratory muscles. Brock reached the barn entrance about 4 minutes after the encounter and collapsed just outside the door. He was unable to call for help. The multiple envenomations had delivered a substantial venom load, rapidly compromising his ability to breathe. The ranch owner discovered Brock approximately 68 minutes later when he returned to check on the progress. Brock was unresponsive, lying face down near the barn entrance. His breathing had ceased, and his skin had taken on a cyanotic appearance. Emergency services were called immediately, but Brock showed no signs of life when responders arrived 16 minutes later. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be respiratory failure due to cobra envenomation. Tissue analysis from the bite wounds showed venom consistent with monocled cobra envenomation. The time elapsed between the attack and discovery, approximately 72 minutes, combined with the severity of 3 rapid strikes, meant survival was virtually impossible, even with immediate intervention. The examiner noted that the cobra's normal striking behavior, coupled with multiple envenomations and the rural location delaying aid, caused massive venom injection and rapid neuromuscular paralysis, leading to complete respiratory arrest. Investigators searched the barn and found the cobra still present, coiled in the same corner area. The snake was captured by a reptile specialist and later identified as a monocled cobra, likely an escaped or released exotic pet. No owner was ever identified. It was August 3rd, 2018, and the morning sun had already baked the red earth of Mukuvisi woodlands into a hard crust. Limani Chikweche was 6 hours away from retirement, unaware that one of Africa's deadliest serpents lay coiled in the shadows. Limani Chikweche was a 58-year-old senior ranger at the Mukuvisi Woodlands Reserve on Harare's southern outskirts. He had built his reputation on strict adherence to bush safety protocols and an almost legendary ability to read animal behavior. Rangers half his age still repeated his training mantras about snake identification and proper evacuation procedures. This final patrol before his retirement ceremony was meant to be ceremonial, a last walk through the territory he had protected for 3 decades. That morning's patrol was routine by design. Limani had requested a junior ranger named Tapiwa Moyo accompany him, wanting to pass along final observations about the eastern boundary trails where poaching signs had recently appeared. At approximately 10:15 a.m., Limani stopped the patrol vehicle near a large termite mound, roughly 200 yards from the main access road. He informed Tapiwa he needed to relieve himself and would step behind the mound for privacy. Tapiwa remained in the vehicle, facing the direction Limani had gone, maintaining standard protocol for paired patrols. The area around the mound showed signs of recent animal activity, disturbed soil and scattered debris that might have indicated a burrow system nearby. The entire reserve had experienced an unusually active snake season that year, with sightings up nearly 40% according to incident logs. Staff meetings had emphasized heightened caution, particularly around rock piles and termite structures where mambas often sheltered during the heat of the day. Limani himself had led 2 of those training sessions, demonstrating proper approach techniques and safe distances. Less than 30 seconds after disappearing behind the mound, Limani suddenly recoiled back into view. His movement was sharp and controlled rather than panicked. Tapiwa watched as Limani pivoted to face him, his right hand gripping his left calf. Without raising his voice, Limani stated clearly that he had been bitten and pointed toward the base of the termite mound, where a large gray-brown snake was withdrawing into a crevice. Tapiwa, who had completed Limani's own snake identification course, immediately recognized the coffin-shaped head and rapid retreat as characteristic of a black mamba. Black mambas can grow up to 14 feet in length, making them Africa's longest venomous snake. They possess potent neurotoxic venom that, without treatment, causes respiratory paralysis. Unlike many snakes that bite defensively and retreat, mambas are known for their speed, capable of moving at 12 miles per hour, and their tendency to deliver multiple strikes when cornered. Tapiwa immediately moved in, applied a broad pressure bandage, and splinted Limani's lower limb. They carried him to the vehicle on an improvised stretcher to avoid exertion. The wrap covered the entire lower leg from the toes upward with firm, even pressure. 2 small puncture wounds were visible on Limani's lower left calf, approximately 3 inches above the ankle, with minimal bleeding. With Tapiwa's assistance, Limani was secured in the passenger seat, while Tapiwa drove toward the main gate at reduced speed, avoiding the jolts and bumps that might accelerate venom circulation. The internal dirt track was rutted and uneven, forcing speeds below 15 miles per hour for much of the 3-mile distance. Approximately 20 minutes after the bite, Lamani reported numbness spreading from his foot up through his knee. His speech remained clear, but he mentioned a metallic taste in his mouth, a known early symptom of neurotoxin absorption. By the time they reached the main gate 30 minutes later, his eyelids had begun drooping, and his words came slower. The reserve's radio contact with external medical services had been intermittent due to equipment issues, causing a 15-minute delay in ambulance dispatch. No black mamba antivenom was stored at the reserve, requiring transport to a hospital in central Harare. Vision blurring became pronounced as they met the ambulance at the highway junction. During the ambulance ride, his respiratory effort became labored despite oxygen administration. Paralysis was advancing through the muscle groups controlling breathing. They reached the hospital 77 minutes after the bite. Medical staff administered polyvalent antivenom, but the neurological damage had already progressed significantly. Lamani lost consciousness as respiratory muscles failed. Mechanical ventilation was initiated, but his condition continued deteriorating. He was pronounced dead at 1:43 p.m. from respiratory arrest secondary to neurotoxic envenomation. Mukuvisi Woodlands held a small memorial service 3 days later, attended by rangers Lamani had trained and the families he had served alongside. Local news covered the incident briefly, noting the irony of an experienced ranger dying from the very hazard he had spent decades teaching others to avoid. Lamani's perfect protocol proved futile against a single mamba strike on his final patrol. It was December 10, 2012, deep in the lowland forests of Bolivia, a place where the air felt heavy and alive, pressing down like a damp blanket. The canopy above was a living ceiling, a patchwork of emerald leaves swaying in the humid breeze. Down on the forest floor, sunlight struggled to break through, filtering into thin shafts that lit up clouds of drifting insects. Beneath the tangled green was another world entirely, one ruled by predators, some killed with teeth and claws, others with stealth and muscle, and some with coils so powerful they could silence even the strongest prey. For the 26-year-old Javier Ortega, this wilderness was not a place to fear. It was home. Born and raised in a small village near the Rio Mamoré, he had grown up navigating the slow, muddy waters in dugout canoes, fishing for piranha and catfish, and hunting small game in the surrounding forest. He knew the dangers here, jaguars lurking in the shadows, caimans watching from the riverbanks, venomous snakes coiled under fallen logs. But the boa constrictor? That was different. Boas were common here, and people spoke of them with respect, not dread. They were powerful, yes, but unlike anacondas or highly venomous species, they rarely attacked humans. They hunted rodents, birds, and monkeys, not grown men, or so Javier believed. One humid afternoon in late November, Javier set out to check his family's banana plot with only a worn machete and a sack. The rain-slick trail closed in with low vines and stifling heat. Near a bend in the path, he paused to rest, leaning on the worn wooden handle of his machete. That's when it struck. From the leaf litter at his feet, a thick, muscular shape erupted with startling speed. Before Javier could move, the head of a massive boa constrictor, over 15 feet long and as thick as his thigh, latched onto his calf. Its recurved teeth anchored deep into his flesh, holding him like a hooked fish. Pain shot up his leg. He shouted in shock, stumbling backward, but the snake was already in motion. In less than a second, its body surged upward, looping tightly around his legs, then his hips, then his torso. The pressure was immediate and suffocating. Javier swung his machete wildly, hacking at the coils. But the angle was wrong, and the blade was dull. The snake's grip tightened with every exhale, a slow, deliberate rhythm designed to crush and suffocate. Constriction doesn't break bones. It stops blood flow, it prevents the lungs from expanding, and it forces the heart to strain against impossible pressure. Within moments, the forest was filled with the sound of his choking breaths, each one shallower than the last. Somewhere farther down the path, two boys gathering firewood heard the noise. They followed the sound until they stumbled into the clearing and froze. Javier was on the ground, half hidden beneath a living knot of scales. His face was flushed dark red, eyes wide in panic. One of the boys bolted back toward the village, shouting for help. The other stayed, yelling and throwing sticks at the snake in a desperate attempt to distract it. The boa didn't flinch. Its coils shifted slightly, readjusting, squeezing harder. Minutes later, several men burst through the trees, machetes and wooden clubs in hand. They attacked from all sides, hacking at the thick body. The snake writhed violently, tail whipping across the ground, but still it held on. Finally, with one powerful swing, a man severed its head. The coils loosened, and the snake's body fell away, twitching with reflexive contractions. But it was already too late. Javier's body lay limp in the mud. His chest was still, everything pounding his back, shaking his shoulders, pressing their mouths to his in a frantic attempt to breathe life back into him. But nothing worked. They stood in silence, the enormity of what had happened sinking in. Someone muttered a prayer. Others glanced down at the dead snake, its skin glistening in the dim light, the sheer size of it a grim reminder of its power. By nightfall, the story had spread through the village. People spoke in hushed voices, warning children not to wander alone, especially during the wet season when snakes hunted more actively. For many, it was the first time they had heard of a boa killing a man. In the days that followed, a few outsiders came to ask questions. Wildlife experts explained that while such attacks were rare, they were not impossible. Large boas are ambush predators, striking when prey comes too close. Once their coils lock in, escape is almost impossible without immediate and violent intervention. The attack shattered a long-held belief in the village that the boa constrictor was harmless to adults. Javier had grown up with that idea, and it had cost him his life. The Bolivian boa's deadly grip was a silent reminder that brute strength can be just as lethal as venom. It was May 3rd, 2016, in a remote village by the river in Pará, Brazil. The morning was foggy from the village. The river looked calm and slow, but the shadows along the water hinted at hidden dangers below the surface. André Silva was 32 years old and had spent years studying snakes. He was an amateur snake expert who worked with a small local zoo. He documented snake movements and sometimes caught specimens for research. He lived with his wife and young child, who he talked about often. He saw his work as a way to balance his interest in snakes with providing for his family. André was confident in his field skills and experienced with large snakes, but his confidence sometimes made him take unnecessary risks. He often went into thick jungle areas alone, believing his knowledge and strength could handle environmental dangers. That day, he planned to trap and measure a female anaconda that locals had warned was unusually aggressive. André had been tracking the river and its tributaries for weeks. He mapped snake locations, noted water depths, and recorded movements. He carried measuring tools, a small net, and a bag with snake handling equipment. He wore waterproof boots and lightweight clothing, but the forest floor was slippery, and tree roots stuck out unpredictably. Despite these precautions, the thick vegetation and shallow streams created hidden dangers. The riverbank was soft and muddy, and the water often hid sudden drop-offs. The target of André's expedition was a female green anaconda that could reach over 20 feet long and weigh several hundred pounds. These snakes kill by squeezing, applying huge pressure until prey suffocates. While they are usually ambush predators, anacondas react quickly to threats, striking defensively if disturbed. Their muscular bodies allow them to coil and pull even large animals into water, where escape becomes difficult. Warnings had been frequent. Villagers mentioned unusual behavior from the anaconda, including getting upset when boats came near and sightings of her coiled near fishing paths. They told Andre not to enter the water alone or try to corner the snake, but he ignored these observations, trusting his handling techniques and experience with smaller snakes. He stepped into a tributary around 4 p.m., believing it to be shallow, unaware of a sudden drop-off hidden by murky water and water plants. As Andre waded in, his foot sank deeper than expected, causing him to lose his balance. He bent forward to steady himself, accidentally disturbing the anaconda, which had been coiled along the bank. Villagers on a nearby ridge saw him stumble and noticed the massive green body of the snake rising in a defensive posture. Andre tried to step back, but the anaconda's coils gradually wrapped around his legs and lower body, pulling him slowly toward deeper water. His bag and tools scattered into the shallows, creating noise and further agitation. The struggle lasted several minutes. The initial coil around Andre's legs restricted his movement, and each of his attempts to free himself caused the snake to adjust its position, gradually tightening its grip. His arms moved through mud and reeds, stirring the water, while the anaconda shifted defensively rather than aggressively hunting. Water rose to his waist and then chest as the snake's strength slowly pulled him farther into the tributary. From the ridge, villagers could see floating items, his hat, and scattered tools, but the details of the snake's hold were mostly obscured by reeds and murky water. Despite splashing and struggling, Andre could not free himself, and the surrounding brush prevented direct assistance. By the time local rescuers reached the tributary, the snake had released him and withdrawn into the riverbank vegetation, likely due to lack of movement or perceived threat. Only the coils remained briefly visible in the shallow water. Andre's body was never recovered. The river and its deep channels had hidden all trace. His measuring tools, net and bag, were found partially floating downstream, muddy and waterlogged. Villagers conducted a ceremonial ritual along the river, leaving offerings to honor his memory and the forces of the river, a customary practice for those lost to natural hazards. Later, the same anaconda was spotted but never captured, moving silently through the tributary system. The incident showed the dangers of underestimating the environment and overestimating personal skill. Investigators noted that the drop-off Andre had misjudged, combined with the snake's defensive response, created a realistic and fatal situation. It was June 22, 2014, and the rural farmlands of East Texas stretched endlessly under the evening sky as Jake Morrison drove his pickup truck along dusty back roads toward his final service call of the day. The 29-year-old wildlife removal specialist had been working since dawn, responding to calls from farmers and homeowners dealing with unwanted animal visitors on their properties. Jake operated a small wildlife control business that served the rural communities scattered across East Texas, an area where encounters between humans and dangerous wildlife were common. He had 5 years of experience removing common species like raccoons, opossums, and non-venomous snakes, but his training with venomous species was limited. Financial pressures from his recent marriage had forced Jake to accept jobs he wasn't fully qualified for, including calls involving potentially dangerous snakes. The call had come from a local farmer who reported finding a colorful snake in his chicken coop. Jake was rushing to complete multiple service calls in one day to maximize his income, a practice that often led to careless mistakes. He carried basic equipment in his truck, but lacked the specialized tools and training necessary for safely handling venomous species. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away through rural back roads, and Jake had no access to anti-venom or emergency medical support. Texas coral snakes are among North America's most venomous species, possessing a potent neurotoxic venom that attacks the nervous system and causes respiratory paralysis. They are small, secretive snakes that are often confused with harmless species like the scarlet king snake, leading to dangerous misidentifications. Coral snakes have a distinctive banding pattern of red, yellow, and black rings, but the traditional rhyme used to identify them can be unreliable under poor lighting conditions or stress. Their venom contains powerful neurotoxins that cause muscle paralysis and respiratory failure, making immediate medical treatment essential for survival. Jake arrived at the farm just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the property that made visibility poor. The farmer led him to the chicken coop where he had spotted the snake, describing it as having bright red, yellow, and black bands. In the dim lighting of the coop, Jake examined the snake and attempted to identify it using the Red Touch's black, friend of Jack Rhyme, which proved unreliable under the poor lighting conditions. The poor lighting and Jake's fatigue from a long day of work led him to misidentify the Texas coral snake as a harmless scarlet king snake. This fatal mistake caused Jake to handle the snake without gloves or proper restraint equipment, believing he was dealing with a non-venomous species that posed no threat to his safety. Jake reached down and grasped the snake behind its head, intending to remove it from the chicken coop and relocate it to a more appropriate habitat. The snake initially remained calm, but as Jake continued handling it and applied pressure while trying to secure his grip, the coral snake became defensive and bit him on the thumb. It started to clamp down and chewed for several seconds before its small fangs penetrated the skin and injected a dose of potent neurotoxic venom. Jake immediately realized his mistake as he looked more closely at the snake's banding pattern in better light. The distinctive red bands touching yellow bands clearly identified the snake as a venomous coral snake, not the harmless king snake he had thought he was handling. Jake released the snake and examined the small puncture wounds on his thumb, knowing that he had just received a potentially dangerous envenomation. Jake rushed to his truck and began the 45-minute drive to the nearest hospital, but panic and distraction from the snake bite caused him to drive erratically. His anxiety about the envenomation and fatigue from his long workday impaired his concentration and judgment behind the wheel. Jake's vision became affected by stress and fear as he worried about the venom's effects, making it increasingly difficult to focus on driving safely. 20 minutes into his desperate race to reach medical help, Jake's panic and exhaustion caused him to lose control of his pickup truck on a sharp curve. He crashed into a roadside ditch, the impact rendering him unconscious. Jake remained trapped in his vehicle for several hours before being discovered, during which time the coral snake venom continued its progression through his system. The farmer found Jake's crashed truck 3 hours later when he went to check on the wildlife removal specialist who had failed to return for payment. By the time emergency responders extracted Jake from the wreckage and transported him to the hospital, the neurotoxic venom had caused severe respiratory depression. Jake died from respiratory failure several hours after the bite, as the rural hospital lacked the ventilatory support equipment necessary to maintain his breathing until anti-venom could be obtained. The investigation revealed that Jake had misidentified a deadly coral snake as a harmless species, leading to his fatal envenomation. The delayed discovery of his crash and the lack of immediate respiratory support contributed to the tragic outcome. His death highlighted the dangers faced by wildlife control operators who lack proper training and equipment for handling venomous species. Jake's widow was devastated by the loss of her new husband, and the incident led to enhanced training requirements for wildlife removal specialists throughout Texas. It was June 2nd, 2014, and the stifling heat of rural Punjab pressed down on the small village of Malwa Kalan like a weight. The air thick with dust and the smell of ripening wheat, as Harjit Malwa stood in his darkened storage room holding a burlap sack that writhed with the movements of the cobra inside, a solution to his rat problem that would kill him before midnight. Harjit Malwa was a 52-year-old farmer who worked a modest plot of land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He was known throughout the village as stubborn, the kind of man who dismissed modern methods in favor of what he called traditional wisdom. Though his neighbors often pointed out that his traditions were frequently just his own ideas dressed up as ancestral knowledge, His wheat and rice crops were adequate but not exceptional, and he supplemented his income by storing grain for other farmers in a converted room of his house. The rats had become a serious problem over the past month, chewing through sacks and contaminating stores with their droppings. He had lost nearly a quarter of his inventory, and the farmers who had paid him for storage were beginning to complain. His neighbor, Gurmeet, had suggested commercial rat poison or snap traps, even offering to lend him several. Harjit had waved him off dismissively, saying chemicals were expensive and traps required constant monitoring. He had announced his plan 3 days earlier. He would catch a cobra from the fields and release it in his house to hunt the rats naturally. Gurmeet and several other villagers had told him this was insane, that cobras were unpredictable and dangerous, and that bringing one into a home where his wife and 3 children slept was illegal and reckless beyond measure. Harjit had laughed at their concerns, insisting that snakes were nature's solution to rodents, that his grandfather had done the same thing, though no one could verify this claim. His wife had protested, but she said that Harjit had dismissed her worries as feminine overcaution. The fields surrounding the village were a patchwork of irrigation channels and crop rows, the earth cracked and dry between waterings, with dense vegetation along the drainage ditches, where snakes sheltered from the heat. Indian cobras are among the most dangerous snakes in South Asia, responsible for thousands of deaths annually. They typically grow between 4 and 6 feet in length, with fangs capable of delivering a potentially fatal dose of venom, especially when more than one effective bite occurs. The venom is primarily neurotoxic, attacking the nervous system and causing progressive paralysis that eventually stops the diaphragm from functioning, leading to respiratory failure. Cobras are generally shy and will flee from humans when possible, but when cornered or threatened, they become highly defensive, raising their distinctive hoods and striking with remarkable speed and accuracy. Cobras brought indoors are highly unpredictable and unlikely to hunt rodents effectively. Stress and confinement usually make defensive strikes far more likely than purposeful hunting. Harjit had found the cobra 2 days earlier, coiled near an irrigation channel. Using a forked stick and a burlap sack, he had managed to capture it, a process that had taken nearly an hour, according to neighbors. He kept the snake in the sack, tied shut, and placed in a clay pot in his shed, feeding it nothing, believing hunger would make it hunt better, though in reality this only made it more defensive. His eldest son, Navdeep, who was 19 and home from technical college, had seen the pot and asked his father what he was doing. When Harjit explained, Navdeep had stared at him in disbelief, asking if he understood how dangerous this was. Harjit had told him to mind his studies and let men handle practical matters. On the evening of June 2nd, after his wife and younger children had gone to visit her sister in the next village, Harjit decided it was time. Navdeep was in the front room studying when he heard his father moving around in the storage area. Harjit carried the clay pot into the house, the sack inside still moving. He had no protective gloves, snake hooks, or other safety equipment, planning to guide the snake toward the storage room where the rats were most active. He untied the sack in the narrow hallway between the main room and the storage area, then tipped it over and stepped back. The cobra emerged slowly, its body uncoiling as it tasted the air with its tongue, disoriented by the sudden change in environment. Based on brief statements from Harjit, this is how the accident unfolded. He made his first mistake by trying to direct the snake immediately. He jabbed at it with the broom, trying to push it toward the storage room door. The cobra, already stressed from days in captivity, reacted defensively. It raised the front third of its body off the ground, spreading its hood wide, a clear warning display that Harjit either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. He jabbed again, and the snake began moving, but not toward the storage room. It moved toward the corner where shadows offered perceived safety. Harjit stepped forward to cut it off. The broom extended, and the cobra struck. The first bite hit Harjit's right thigh, the fangs punching through the thin cotton of his garment and sinking deep into the muscle. The strike was so fast that Harjit didn't register it until the snake had already pulled back. He shouted in pain and surprise, stumbling backward, and the cobra struck again immediately, hitting the same leg slightly higher, closer to the groin. These were 2 full, effective bites, delivering 2 full venom-injecting bites, with the second strike occurring dangerously close to major blood vessels in the upper thigh, accelerating systemic spread. The fangs left 4 distinct puncture wounds, each bleeding slightly, with visible puncture wounds and progressive swelling, while systemic neurotoxic effects advanced rapidly. Navdeep heard his father's shout and ran from the front room. He found Harjit staggering in the hallway, the cobra already fleeing toward the rafters, its body disappearing into the shadows above. Harjit was clutching his thigh, his face contorted, trying to explain what had happened. Navdeep could see the bite marks. He ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on Gurmeet's door, shouting for help. Within minutes, several neighbors had gathered. They found Harjit sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his leg marked by intense swelling and bleeding. The venom was working rapidly. Harjit had vomited twice. His breathing had become labored, each breath requiring visible effort. Sweat poured down his face despite the evening coolness. The pain in his leg was intense, and he was moaning continuously, a low sound that frightened the neighbors more than screaming would have. They loaded him into the back of Gurmeet's pickup truck, Navdeep climbing in beside his father. The nearest clinic with anti-venom was in the town of Moga, nearly 15 miles away on poorly maintained roads, resulting in a prolonged transport time. No airway support or assisted ventilation was available during transport. As they drove, Harjit's condition deteriorated rapidly. The paralysis began in his extremities, a tingling numbness spreading upward. His eyelids began to droop, the muscles controlling them affected by the neurotoxin. His breathing became increasingly shallow as the venom attacked the nerves controlling his diaphragm. Navdeep held his father's hand, watching helplessly as consciousness faded from his eyes. They arrived at the clinic approximately 40 minutes after the bite. Medical staff rushed out to meet them, but Harjit was already unresponsive, his breathing barely perceptible. They carried him inside and attempted resuscitation, administering antivenom and providing respiratory support. But the absence of early ventilation combined with the double thigh envenomation and long transport had allowed respiratory paralysis to progress beyond reversal. His diaphragm had stopped functioning, and despite manual ventilation efforts, his heart stopped within minutes. He was declared dead at 9:47 p.m. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be respiratory failure due to neurotoxic envenomation from an Indian cobra bite. The house was fumigated the following day by a professional snake handler from Moga, who found the cobra coiled in the rafters above the storage room and removed it. Harjit's family held a funeral attended by most of the village. Navdeep left college to help support the family, taking work in Moga and sending money home. It was April 12, 2016, when the morning sun cast long shadows across a rural property outside Ocala, Florida. The converted barn sat isolated on 5 acres, housing 47 venomous snakes from 6 continents. The nearest neighbor lived nearly half a mile away, unaware of the deadly collection maintained beyond the palmetto brush. Richard Kowalski was 47 years old, a former University of Florida herpetology student who had dropped out during his junior year. Over 22 years, he had built a reputation in underground exotic animal circles as a fearless breeder. His grandfather's inherited property had been converted into a makeshift serpentarium, outfitted with climate control and enclosures constructed from cattle troughs and modified aquariums. His wife had filed for divorce 4 years earlier, taking their children back to Jacksonville as Richard's obsession consumed their marriage and finances. He supported himself through illegal sales to private collectors, holding permits for only a limited number of species, while maintaining 47 venomous snakes on site. Richard had survived 3 previous envenomations. At 29, a spitting cobra had struck his forearm, requiring hospitalization. A copperhead bit his hand 5 years later. In 2012, a Malayan pit viper struck his calf, sending him to the hospital for antivenin and a week of observation. Each survival reinforced his reputation for risk-heavy handling practices. The crown jewel of his collection was an exceptionally large king cobra, measuring over 14 feet in length, purchased for $8,000 and housed in a modified cattle trough, measuring 8 by 4 feet. That Tuesday morning began with a mild hangover. Richard woke at 8:45 a.m. and walked to the barn. Inside, he worked through routine checks, noting that the king cobra had not eaten in nearly 3 weeks, a longer interval than his usual feeding schedule. Standard feeding protocol called for using a 3-foot hook with a secured rat to maintain distance. Instead, Richard hand-positioned a live rat to provoke a feeding response. At approximately 9:30 a.m., he unlatched the enclosure lid and leaned over the opening, extending his left hand with the squirming rat toward the far corner. His right hand gripped the edge of the trough for balance as he leaned forward, his upper body positioned deep over the enclosure. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes in the world, capable of raising nearly a third of their body off the ground while spreading their hood to full width. Their strike height can reach a standing adult's chest. They possess one of the largest venom yields of any snake species, delivering powerful neurotoxins capable of shutting down the nervous system and respiratory muscles. King cobras are highly alert animals with advanced spatial awareness and a strong memory for perceived threats. The cobra had been resting low along the enclosure floor, partially obscured by substrate and shadow. The rat's frantic movement triggered an immediate response. The massive snake surged upward, hood flaring wide as it closed the distance in a fraction of a second. Richard remained motionless. Then the cobra struck. The impact was reconstructed as sudden and forceful. Bite marks on Richard's right forearm below the elbow showed 2 deep punctures consistent with a king cobra strike. Tissue damage around the wounds indicated a brief hold before release, after which the snake retreated back into the enclosure. Scuff marks near the trough suggested Richard stumbled backward immediately after being struck. Blood pooled beneath his arm, forming 2 distinct drip patterns on the concrete floor. Investigators found no evidence of pressure being applied to the wounds and no outgoing emergency calls from his phone. Based on the location of blood stains and the position of his phone on the workbench 15 feet away, he appeared to have moved away from the enclosure shortly after the bite. Over the following period, the sequence of events was inferred from physical evidence inside the barn. The phone was recovered from the floor near the workbench, showing failed unlock attempts. Additional smears along the wall and bench edge suggested deteriorating coordination. Neurological impairment consistent with neurotoxic envenomation would explain the loss of fine motor control indicated by these signs. Further evidence supported progressive weakness. Saliva residue and disturbed items near the workbench were consistent with difficulty swallowing. Additional fingerprints and partial handprints lower on the wall suggested increasing muscle fatigue as he attempted to steady himself. Richard's body was found several feet from the workbench, positioned on his side. Bruising to the shoulder and head matched a fall onto the concrete floor. The absence of defensive injuries or crawl marks indicated that loss of muscle control had progressed rapidly after the collapse. Respiratory failure was determined to have occurred later. The position of his body and lack of movement marks beyond the fall site suggested he remained where he collapsed. The medical examiner concluded that paralysis of the muscles required for breathing led to shallow, ineffective respiration before complete respiratory arrest. Cardiac activity continued briefly after breathing ceased, consistent with hypoxic cardiac failure following neurotoxic envenomation. The following morning, a neighbor discovered the open barn door while checking fence lines along his property. Sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes, followed by Florida Fish and Wildlife officers. Inspectors documented 47 venomous snakes, with 35 held beyond permitted allowances. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as respiratory failure due to venomous snakebite. All surviving snakes were transferred to licensed facilities. It was July 19, 2014, in Maricopa County, Arizona. The residential neighborhood consisted of single-story homes on half-acre lots, separated by desert landscaping of gravel, cacti, and drought-resistant shrubs. Emmett Foley was 52 years old, a high school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years. He lived alone in a 3-bedroom house with an attached 2-car garage. Emmett was methodical and routine-oriented, parking in the driveway and using the garage for storage and a small workshop. He had no particular interest in reptiles and had only encountered native snakes in his yard, which he avoided and reported to pest control. 3 days earlier, a neighbor reported that his adult son's pet snake had escaped from their garage. It was described as a large snake, roughly 6 feet long. Emmett had heard about it, but assumed it would either be found quickly or stay away from houses. On the evening of July 19th, Emmett arrived home at 8:30 p.m. from a tutoring session. He parked and entered through the front door, later moving through the interior door connecting the house to the garage. He turned on the overhead light, revealing a cluttered space filled with boxes, tools, sports equipment, and a pile of camping gear. He heard faint scraping from the far corner near the camping gear. Monocled cobras, native to South and Southeast Asia, are highly venomous and popular in the exotic pet trade. Adults typically measure 4 to 6 feet in length and weigh 3 to 6 pounds. They cannot establish populations in non-native climates, but can survive temporarily in temperature-controlled human structures. Their neurotoxic venom blocks nerve signals, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. Cobras strike quickly, inject venom, and usually release rather than holding their bite, although they will re-strike if threatened. Emmett approached the far corner, where his camping gear was stacked. The cobra, coiled behind a storage bin, had detected his movement and body heat. It had likely entered the garage through a gap under the main door. Emerging with its hood partially flared, it moved between Emmett and the gear, lifting the front third of its body and swaying slightly. Emmett froze, recognizing the snake from its distinctive hood. He took a slow step backward. The cobra held its position for roughly 3 seconds. Emmett tried to retreat toward the interior door, but his heel caught on a toolbox, and he stumbled backward onto the concrete floor. The cobra lunged. Its fangs struck Emmett's right thigh just above the knee, penetrating through his pants into the muscle. He yelled and swatted at the snake. The cobra released, then struck again, catching his left forearm. This bite was briefer, and Emmett pulled his arm away forcefully. The snake dropped to the ground and retreated behind the camping gear. Emmett sustained 2 bite wounds. The thigh bite had 2 puncture marks approximately 0.5 inches apart, bleeding immediately with a burning sensation. The forearm bite was shallower but distinct, with fang marks about 0.4 inches apart. Pain radiated up his limbs, and he felt tingling in his lips and tongue as systemic effects began. Scrambling to his feet, Emmett covered the 15 feet to the interior door in about 5 seconds. He stumbled into the house and called emergency services, describing the cobra. Within 10 minutes, his speech became slurred, and hand coordination faltered. By 15 minutes, he had trouble balancing. The venom was rapidly affecting his neuromuscular function. Responders arrived 11 minutes later. Emmett collapsed on the kitchen floor, unresponsive and breathing inadequately. Assisted ventilation was provided, and he was transported while receiving life support. During transport, his condition deteriorated, and he never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead 97 minutes after the bite. The cause of death was respiratory arrest due to neurotoxic envenomation from a monocled cobra. The examiner noted that 2 rapid bites delivered a high combined venom load to vascular tissue in the thigh and forearm, causing progressive paralysis of muscles controlling respiration. Despite aggressive intervention, the neurotoxic effects proved fatal, particularly because no immediate airway support had been applied. Investigators searched the garage and found the cobra coiled behind the camping gear. A reptile specialist captured it safely. The snake was identified as a monocled cobra, likely abandoned or escaped. No owner was ever located. The incident prompted local authorities to inspect nearby properties for illegally kept exotic animals and raised awareness of the dangers posed by escaped or released exotic pets in residential areas. It was March 8th, 2015, and the late afternoon sun beat down on the remote property outside Cuiabá, Mato Grosso, where a rotting wooden shed stood surrounded by dense scrubland. Inside, beneath the warped floorboards that creaked with every step, lived a massive bushmaster that an old farmer insisted was harmless to him. Odorico Feitosa was a 67-year-old retired farmer who had spent his entire life in the Mato Grosso region. His weathered hands and sun-darkened skin told the story of decades working the land, and his neighbors knew him as much for his competence as for his increasingly eccentric relationship with wildlife. Over the past year, Odorico had been feeding scraps and occasional dead rats to what he claimed was a single bushmaster snake living beneath his tool shed. He spoke of the serpent with proprietary affection, referring to it as his snake, describing how it had grown fat and lazy under his care. What made this dangerous obsession more troubling was Odorico's deep distrust of modern medicine. He had never visited a hospital in his adult life, believing that natural toughness and his body's resilience were superior to doctors and their interventions. That same stubbornness would prove fatal when his son-in-law, Marco, drove 3 hours that March day to help prepare the property for sale. Bushmasters are among the largest venomous snakes in the Americas, reaching lengths of up to 10 feet and weighing over 11 pounds. Their hemotoxic venom is among the most potent of any viper, designed to destroy blood cells and tissue. When threatened, bushmasters strike with remarkable speed and may deliver multiple bites in rapid succession. Marco arrived mid-afternoon. Odorico led Marco to the shed, explaining his intention to relocate the snake before potential buyers toured the property. The interior smelled of rot and stored animal feed. Bags of grain stacked against walls filmed with dust. Rats scattered across the rafters as the door swung open. Odorico crouched near the center of the floor where several boards sat loose, their edges splintered. He worked his fingers beneath them, prying them up with his bare hands. The bushmaster lay coiled in the dim space beneath the floorboards, easily 7 feet long and thick as a man's forearm. Its patterned scales were barely visible in the shadows created by the stored feed bags. Odorico reached down, perhaps intending to demonstrate his claimed rapport with the creature, when the snake's head snapped forward twice in rapid succession, fangs penetrating deep into his exposed forearm just below the elbow. The strikes happened too fast for Odorico to react. He jerked backward in surprise. Upon realizing what happened, Marco moved to help his father-in-law stand and wrapped a cloth loosely around his forearm to slow movement while attempting to call emergency services. Odorico waved him off repeatedly, insisting everything was fine. The older man refused water when Marco retrieved a bottle from the truck. Within 20 to 30 minutes, swelling had spread past Odorico's elbow, and dark bruising and patchy discoloration appeared around the bite and along the forearm. His fingers began to swell noticeably, the skin taut and shiny. Marco's assistants transformed into urgent pleas for Odorico to let him call an ambulance. He shook his head, even managing a laugh, maintaining his lifelong stance against hospitals. Marco begged him to reconsider, describing how his color was draining and how his lips had taken on a grayish tint. But Odorico's stubbornness held firm, even as his strength visibly ebbed. Over the next 4 hours, Odorico remained on the floor of the shed, his back propped against a support beam. The swelling continued spreading up his arm and across his chest. His speech became increasingly slurred, words running together as the venom's effects on his cardiovascular system intensified. Blood began seeping from his nose and the corners of his mouth, signs that his blood had lost its ability to clot properly. His breathing grew shallow and labored. Marco stayed beside him the entire time. By early evening, Odorico had stopped responding to questions. His eyes remained half open, but unfocused. His chest continued to rise and fall in irregular intervals. Just after 8 o'clock, roughly 4.5 hours after the bite, his breathing stopped entirely. Marco finally called emergency services, but it was far too late. The coroner's report, issued 3 days later, listed the cause of death as envenomation, resulting in cardiovascular collapse and internal hemorrhaging. Odorico's body remained in the shed until authorities arrived the following morning. The property was never sold. Wildlife officials later arrived equipped with snake hooks, tongs, and secure bags to capture the bushmaster, which they relocated to a protected forest area several miles from human habitation. Marco would later tell investigators that his father-in-law had seemed convinced, until nearly the end, that his body would overcome the venom naturally, that his decades of toughness would see him through. It was July 14th, 2014, on the marshy northern shore of Louisiana's Lake Pontchartrain, a vast brackish lake where Gulf tides met inland rivers. Its shoreline was wild and untamed, with tall reeds, half-sunken cypress roots, and air heavy with salt and decay. Locals knew the place well. For some, it was a paradise good fishing, peaceful sunsets, and nights where the horizon glowed orange from distant city lights. For others, it carried a quiet unease, a healthy respect for the creatures that called the marsh home. And among those creatures, one stood above the rest as the most feared, the cottonmouth, or water moccasin. Thick-bodied, venomous, and notoriously short-tempered, cottonmouths were infamous in the South for holding their ground. While most snakes slither away at the first sign of trouble, the cottonmouth often stood its ground, hooding its mouth wide to flash the ghostly white interior that gave it its name. In Louisiana, they were a fact of life. In the marshes around Pontchartrain, they were everywhere. That afternoon, 42-year-old Roy Lambert parked by an overgrown levee and headed for the shore with his tackle box and cooler. He'd fished these waters since boyhood, knew the snakes well, and had never had trouble as long as you watched your step. Roy headed to a shaded channel, set down his cooler, and cast his line. The bobber plopped into the still water, ripples fading into the heavy summer quiet. On his third cast, he caught movement in the reeds just off to his left. At first, it was only a faint ripple disturbing the surface, small enough to pass for a turtle or a muskrat. But then the ripples straightened into a purposeful line, cutting toward him. A shape emerged, a broad, triangular head lifting just above the waterline. Two dark, unblinking eyes locked on him. The snake's thick, muscular body slid forward with an unhurried confidence, the wake fanning out behind it. Then the mouth opened, flashing that unmistakable cotton-white interior, a warning. Roy froze, his pulse quickening. The cottonmouth didn't break its approach. He took a careful step back toward the bank, but his heel sank into the mud, holding him for just a fraction too long. The snake closed the distance with surprising speed, head rising higher, tongue flicking in rapid bursts. Roy swung his fishing rod down toward it, hoping to scare it off. It didn't work. In an instant, the cottonmouth struck, a blur of motion that buried its fangs deep into the meat of his calf. The pain was instant and violent, a white-hot burn that shot upward through his leg. He stumbled back, splashing into the shallows, but before he could regain his footing, the snake struck again, this time sinking its fangs just above the knee. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, sliding back into the reeds, vanishing into the marsh's tangled green. The venom worked quickly. Within moments, his calf was swelling, the skin flushed and tight. A deep ache radiated from the wounds, accompanied by a strange, metallic taste in his mouth. His leg throbbed in time with his heartbeat, each pulse spreading the pain further. Gritting his teeth, Roy tried to push himself upright and limp toward the levee. But each step was slower than the last. His breathing quickened, his chest tight. The path back seemed longer than it had minutes ago, the mud pulling at his boots like it wanted to keep him there. Halfway to the road, his vision blurred. The heat pressed in on him from all sides. He tried to call out for help, but the words came out thin and slurred. His legs buckled, dropping him face first into the warm, sticky mud. Down the shore, two teenagers were fishing off a small dock. One glanced up and saw Roy lying in the marsh, barely moving. They shouted to him, but he didn't respond. Dropping their rods, they sprinted toward him, splashing through the shallows. By the time they reached him, Roy's lips were blue and his breathing shallow. Paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, but his pulse was faint, and he was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. The cottonmouth was never found. Word of Roy's death spread quietly among the locals. In bait shops and on back porches, people shook their heads and spoke in low voices. He was experienced, careful. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And in the snake-filled shallows of the lake, you weren't always the hunter. Sometimes you were the prey. It was August 12th, 2015, in a quiet neighborhood in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The late afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the well-kept lawns. From the street, nothing seemed unusual, and the houses looked calm. But inside one of the homes at the end of the street, an accident was quietly taking shape. Roger Halston was 45 years old and lived alone in his 2-story house. He had been obsessed with snakes since his 20s, and over the years had built a collection of more than 50 snakes. His collection included large Burmese pythons, king cobras, and several species of vipers. He had changed his home to fit them, filling the basement with glass tanks, heat lamps, and other equipment. The air was thick with the musky smell of snake waste, which he considered a minor problem. Roger spent his time reading about snakes, keeping feeding logs and watching behavior, rarely leaving the basement for anything else. A week earlier, Roger had bought a rare white king cobra from a private seller. Known for being unpredictable, the snake was considered both a challenge and a prized addition among collectors. Earlier that week, a python had bitten him while he was fixing its tank, but he dismissed it as minor. That evening, he planned to feed several snakes at once, confident he could manage the risks. Friends and fellow hobbyists had warned him repeatedly against handling multiple venomous snakes at the same time, warning that even a small mistake could be fatal. But he ignored them. The basement was dimly lit, with heat lamps buzzing above each tank. Feeding containers and empty boxes were scattered across the floor, along with snake-handling tools and partially prepared frozen rodents. The aisles between tanks were narrow, leaving little room to move. The snakes themselves ranged from 10-foot Burmese pythons to adult king cobras, each capable of deadly defensive behavior if startled. Pythons squeeze with enormous strength, and venomous snakes like king cobras and vipers can strike quickly, affecting the nervous system or delivering tissue-damaging venom. Neighbors had noticed unusual activity in Roger's home. Some had seen large boxes of snakes arriving and were sometimes overwhelmed by the smell coming from his basement. A few had casually warned him about stacking tanks too high and overfilling his space. Local rules required secure handling and containment for venomous snakes. But Roger, overconfident in his experience, ignored the warning signs. He overlooked hissed warnings, defensive coiling, and repeated strikes at his gloved hands during routine feeding. At about 7:45 p.m., Roger began the feeding process. He carried several dead rodents into the basement, moving from tank to tank. The vipers were the first to react defensively. One viper jerked backward sharply when Roger's hand approached, narrowly missing a bite. Distracted, he stepped awkwardly, his foot catching the edge of a nearby python tank. The small python tipped over, falling with a crash that echoed across the cramped basement. The noise startled several snakes in the immediate area. One python lunged defensively at Roger's legs, followed moments later by another reacting to nearby movement. The white king cobra, sensing sudden disturbance, struck defensively at exposed arms and legs. Each snake acted independently, responding to vibrations, sudden motions, and unfamiliar sounds in its immediate environment. Other snakes coiled defensively or retreated to corners of the basement, avoiding direct involvement. A neighbor, Sarah Peterson, later reported hearing loud hisses, thuds, and breaking glass faintly audible through a partially open basement window. Alarmed, she called 911. Roger's struggle lasted only a few minutes. By the time help arrived, he was found unresponsive, partially coiled by one large python, Bite marks were evident from the king cobra, which had begun causing severe neurotoxic effects, and from several vipers. The floor was scattered with broken glass, bedding, and overturned feeding containers. 3 of the snakes were captured in temporary boxes, while the remainder hid in basement corners or dense vegetation near the house, out of sight. Security cameras from neighbors captured some movement and disturbances, confirming that the sequence of events, including slipping, tipping a tank, and startling the snakes, directly led to the fatal incident, though the strikes themselves were not visible. Investigators concluded that the bites and constriction were defensive responses, not a coordinated attack. Paramedics attempted to stabilize him while animal control worked to secure the remaining snakes. Despite their efforts to administer antivenom and provide emergency care, the combined effects of multiple venomous bites and progressive python constriction had already caused severe damage. The king cobra's venom affected his nervous system. The viper bites caused tissue damage, and the python's gradual constriction further complicated his breathing and blood circulation. In the weeks following the incident, the city reviewed private ownership regulations for venomous reptiles, imposing stricter containment and liability rules. Prospective snake owners were now required to obtain special permits, maintain secure enclosures, and carry liability insurance. The incident also prompted discussions about the ethics and safety of keeping large collections of venomous snakes in residential areas. Wildlife experts emphasized that these animals, while fascinating, require specialized knowledge, proper facilities, and respect for their dangerous nature. It was March 8, 2017, and the suburban neighborhoods of Phoenix, Arizona basked under the desert sun as Bobby Chen worked in his converted garage laboratory. The 34-year-old software engineer had transformed the space into an elaborate reptile facility, complete with custom-built enclosures and climate control systems that housed his secret collection of exotic venomous snakes. Bobby had been illegally importing venomous species for 3 years, building a collection that included 12 different species from around the world. His neighbors had no idea that deadly serpents lived just feet from their own homes, as Bobby had carefully concealed his hobby behind the facade of a normal suburban lifestyle. He had learned everything about snake care from online videos and forums, never receiving formal training in handling venomous species. Bobby worked as a senior developer for a major tech company, earning a substantial salary that funded his expensive and dangerous hobby. He had started with harmless species before gradually acquiring more dangerous specimens through underground networks and illegal wildlife dealers. His garage had been meticulously converted with temperature controls, humidity systems, and specialized lighting to accommodate species from tropical climates. His prize specimen was a massive gaboon viper from West Africa, a snake he had acquired through illegal wildlife trafficking networks. The snake lived in a custom enclosure that Bobby had built himself, though the habitat was inadequate for such a dangerous animal. Bobby's lack of proper training and equipment had created a disaster waiting to happen, and his habit of drinking beer while performing routine maintenance on his collection would prove fatal. Gaboon vipers are among the world's most dangerous snakes, possessing the longest fangs of any venomous species at up to 2 inches in length. They can inject massive amounts of venom in a single bite, with their cytotoxic poison causing severe tissue death and organ failure. Gaboon vipers are ambush predators with incredible striking speed despite their heavy build, and their excellent camouflage makes them nearly invisible when motionless. Their venom is associated with high mortality without rapid antivenom administration. Bobby had been drinking beer while cleaning multiple snake enclosures, a routine he performed every weekend to maintain his collection. The alcohol had impaired his judgment and slowed his reflexes, making him careless around animals that demanded absolute precision and respect. When he reached the gaboon viper's enclosure, Bobby made the fatal decision to clean the habitat while the snake was still inside. Bobby opened the enclosure door and reached inside with his cleaning tools, believing the snake was docile enough to allow his presence. The gaboon viper lay coiled in the corner of its enclosure, perfectly camouflaged among the artificial plants and substrate. displaying the natural defensive behavior that made these serpents such effective ambush predators. The moment Bobby's hand entered the enclosure, the Gaboon Viper struck with devastating speed in a defensive response to the perceived threat. Its massive head shot forward, and the 2-inch fangs penetrated deep into Bobby's forearm, injecting an enormous dose of cytotoxic venom. Bobby screamed and jerked his arm back, but the snake had already delivered what would prove to be a fatal envenomation. Bobby immediately called 911, but his location in suburban Phoenix presented a unique problem. Identifying the exact species and locating appropriate antivenom would prove logistically complex and time-consuming. The exotic nature of his collection meant that standard snakebite protocols required modification, as emergency rooms needed to identify the specific species before determining treatment options. The Gaboon Viper venom began its devastating work immediately, causing massive tissue death at the bite site, while simultaneously attacking Bobby's internal organs. His forearm swelled to twice its normal size as the cytotoxic poison destroyed muscle, fat, and blood vessels. The venom's hemotoxic components began breaking down his blood cells, causing progressive bleeding throughout his body. Emergency medical personnel arrived within minutes and immediately began providing airway support, intravenous fluids, pain control, and continuous monitoring of Bobby's vital signs. They worked to stabilize his condition while frantically coordinating with poison control centers and herpetologists to identify the exact species and locate appropriate antivenom. Bobby was rushed to the nearest trauma center, where doctors continued supportive care while the antivenom was being located and transported. The delay in obtaining the specific antivenom, combined with the massive dose of venom Bobby had received, created a race against time that medical personnel ultimately could not win. Bobby died from hemorrhagic shock and multiple organ failure 36 hours after the bite, his body overwhelmed by the massive dose of exotic venom despite aggressive medical intervention. Police discovered his illegal collection during the investigation, finding 11 other venomous snakes in various stages of poor health. Bobby's death shocked his family and neighbors, who had no idea about his dangerous hobby. The case led to stricter enforcement of exotic animal laws and enhanced training for emergency responders dealing with unusual envenomation. His death also prompted hospitals in areas with known exotic pet ownership to develop better protocols for identifying and treating non-native snake envenomations. It was October 19th, 2017, and the afternoon sun hung heavy over the acacia-dotted plains outside Nairobi, casting long shadows across the dusty compound where Jabari Ndeti was about to make the last mistake of his life. The German tourists had been asking about dangerous animals all morning, their cameras ready, their excitement palpable, and Jabari, always eager to deliver a story worth retelling, decided to give them something they would never forget. Jabari Ndeti was a 34-year-old freelance safari guide who had built his reputation on spectacle rather than safety. Unlike the guides employed by the established tour companies with their standardized protocols and insurance requirements, Jabari operated independently, taking clients who wanted experiences that felt raw and unfiltered. He was known around Nairobi's budget safari circuit as the guide who would get you close to the action, the one who didn't just talk about wildlife, but interacted with it. His colleagues considered him reckless. His clients thought he was fearless. He had handled snakes before, puff adders, cobras, even a python once, always without incident, which had likely reinforced his belief in his own abilities. This trip was supposed to be straightforward, a day tour for 4 German tourists who had specifically requested him after hearing of his previous demonstrations. The compound where Jabari operated sat on the outskirts of the city, a collection of corrugated metal structures and dusty yards where he kept various animals for educational purposes, though many of these holdings were illegal under Kenyan wildlife regulations. He lived in a small room behind the main building, his income unpredictable but occasionally lucrative when tourists tipped well. His colleagues heard previously that his goal was to save enough to start a legitimate safari company. But for now, he relied on word of mouth and the kind of performances that made people reach for their wallets. The wooden crate sat in the shade of the main building, its contents known only to Jabari and a few other local guides who had warned him repeatedly about keeping it. Black mambas are among Africa's most feared snakes, and for good reason. They can grow up to 14 feet long and are among the fastest snakes, capable of rapid bursts of movement that exceed human reaction time. Their venom is a potent neurotoxin capable of delivering a large, potentially fatal dose in a single effective bite, leading primarily to progressive paralysis of the respiratory muscles. Without antivenom, the mortality rate is extremely high, with death often occurring over several hours as paralysis advances and breathing fails. They are notoriously defensive when cornered and may strike rapidly if provoked. When the German tourists asked about dangerous wildlife, Jabari saw an opportunity. He had shown them photographs, described encounters, but their expressions showed they wanted more. One of them, a man in his 50s, asked if Jabari had ever actually handled a dangerous snake. Jabari smiled and told them to wait. He walked to the wooden crate, ignoring the quick glance of concern from his assistant, a younger man named David who helped with logistics. David had repeatedly warned him that the snake could kill him and that he should never handle it bare-handed, but Jabari waved him off. The crate's lid came off with a creak of nails against wood. Inside, coiled in the dim interior, the black mamba lay mostly still. Jabari had kept it for 3 weeks, feeding it live rats and convincing himself that this constituted some form of relationship. He reached in with his bare hands, grasping the snake behind its head, despite the fact that this is considered extremely dangerous even for trained herpetologists. The mamba was nearly 9 feet long, its body thick and muscular. The tourists gasped excitedly. Jabari, probably feeding off their reaction, made a show of it, explaining in his accented English that this was one of Africa's deadliest creatures, that most people never got this close, that it required absolute respect and understanding. He draped the snake across his shoulders like a living scarf, though its head remained tense, raising and lowering slightly, a clear warning of defensive agitation. The mamba's tongue flicked rapidly, tasting the air, sensing the heat and movement around it. David, standing several feet away, noticed it first, the subtle flattening of the snake's neck, the increased tension in its body. He called out a warning, but Jabari waved him off, too focused on his audience. The tourists were snapping photos frantically, delighted by the spectacle. One of them asked if they could touch it. Jabari was turning to answer, his head angled to the left, when the mamba struck. The attack was faster than human reaction time. The snake delivered a single, precise defensive bite, its head snapping forward in a fraction of a second, with follow-up strikes snapping through the air but failing to connect. Its fangs punctured the skin of his right cheek just below the cheekbone. A large dose of venom was injected directly into the highly vascular tissue of his face, mere inches from major blood vessels. Jabari screamed, a single sharp cry of shock and pain, and grabbed at the snake, pulling it away from his body. The mamba disengaged and retreated, disappearing under the scrap metal and brush at the edge of the compound. The tourists stood frozen. Jabari staggered backward, hand pressed to his cheek where 2 puncture wounds were already swelling. Within 20 minutes, early neurotoxic symptoms set in, with tingling, facial weakness, and muscle twitching spreading down his face and neck. He attempted to speak, but words came slurred. David dialed emergency services immediately, providing a precise location and explaining it was a black mamba bite to the face. The ambulance arrived in approximately 18 minutes, navigating unpaved dirt roads on the outskirts of Nairobi. The paramedics found Jabari conscious but deteriorating steadily. They applied a pressure immobilization bandage and provided oxygen before transporting him to the hospital. The bite's location, close to the brain in tissue rich with blood vessels, meant the neurotoxin spread efficiently. Respiratory muscle weakness progressed over the next hour, his chest movements becoming shallow and irregular as paralysis advanced. Jabari died within 1 hour of the bite, his respiratory system failing as he lost the ability to breathe independently. Antivenom was delayed on arrival, a common limitation in smaller Kenyan hospitals, and supportive measures were insufficient to reverse the paralysis in time. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as respiratory failure, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation from a black mamba bite, noting minimal local injury but profound systemic neuroparalysis. The safari company that occasionally contracted Jabari's services immediately terminated all snake demonstrations across their operations. The German tourists provided statements to police and left Kenya 2 days later, their vacation irrevocably altered. David found other work with a legitimate tour operator. No memorial service was held for Jabari. His family, embarrassed by the circumstances of his death and the illegal keeping of dangerous animals, buried him quietly. It was June 14, 2013, in a quiet residential suburb outside Durban, in South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province. Thabo Ndlovu was 52 years old, a well-known community member who volunteered as a snake relocator. Over more than 15 years, he had removed and relocated over 200 snakes from homes and yards in the surrounding area. He performed these removals free of charge, viewing the work as a public service. At the time, South African law did not require formal certification for private snake handlers. His equipment reflected that informal status: a 3-foot snake hook, a canvas cloth snake bag, and thick leather work gloves. On 5 previous occasions, his call-outs had involved black mambas. Each of those removals had ended without injury. The call came at approximately 3:15 p.m. from a homeowner, Mrs. Sarah Botha. Her children had discovered a large snake inside their garage. Based on her description of its size and coloration, Thabo suspected a black mamba. He drove roughly 18 kilometers to the address. Upon arrival, Mrs. Botha explained that her younger child had seen the snake coiled in the far corner of the garage. Thabo assessed the situation from the open doorway. The snake was visible roughly 4 meters inside, its gray-brown body partially concealed behind stored items. Based on its proportions, it appeared to be a large specimen, estimated at approximately 9 to 10 feet in length. Mrs. Botha and her children retreated into the house while Thabo prepared to enter the garage. He indicated the removal would be brief. He stepped inside, carrying his snake hook and bag. The bag hung from his left shoulder, while his right hand held the hook extended in front of him. The snake remained coiled and alert, tracking his movement. Thabo positioned himself approximately 1 meter from the animal and slowly extended the hook toward its mid-body. Black mambas are Africa's longest venomous snakes, commonly reaching lengths of 8 to 10 feet. Despite their name, their bodies are typically gray or brown, with the black referring to the dark coloration inside their mouths. They are capable of extremely rapid movement and possess highly potent neurotoxic venom that interferes with nerve transmission, leading to progressive paralysis, particularly of the respiratory muscles. Black mambas are not inherently aggressive, but will strike defensively with speed when escape routes are limited. As the hook made contact, Thabo began lifting gently. The mamba reacted instantly. Its body twisted along the length of the hook, redirecting its head toward him. The first strike landed on the right side of his neck. Before he could retreat, the snake struck again, biting his left forearm, followed immediately by a third strike to his right shoulder. The entire sequence lasted only moments. The snake then dropped to the floor and escaped through a gap beneath the garage door. Thabo staggered backward and exited the garage. Blood was visible where the snake had struck his neck. The severity of the situation was immediately apparent, as bites near major blood vessels allow rapid systemic absorption of venom. He sat down against the exterior wall and instructed Mrs. Botha to call for an ambulance. Within minutes, early symptoms appeared. Excessive salivation developed, and a metallic taste became noticeable. His left eyelid began to droop, and swallowing grew difficult. Speech became increasingly slurred as muscle control weakened. A neighbor who was a physician arrived and remained with Thabo, monitoring his condition while emergency services were en route. By approximately 8 minutes after the bites, Thabo's breathing became labored, with shallow, effortful breaths. His ability to speak diminished further, and his vision narrowed as oxygen levels dropped. An ambulance arrived shortly thereafter. Paramedics initiated oxygen support and prepared for rapid transport, recognizing the signs of severe neurotoxic envenomation. Antivenom was not administered on scene and was instead prepared for immediate use upon hospital arrival. Thabo was transported to the nearest hospital, located less than 10 minutes away. Upon arrival, emergency staff administered antivenom and initiated mechanical ventilation. Despite aggressive treatment, including additional antivenom and cardiovascular support, Thabo's respiratory function continued to decline. He suffered cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead at 4:02 p.m., approximately 45 minutes after the initial bites. Post-mortem findings were consistent with severe neurotoxic envenomation leading to respiratory failure. The investigation that followed noted that Thabo's equipment was inadequate for handling a large black mamba in a confined space. His cloth bag offered no rigid containment, and the hook length provided limited margin for error. Authorities emphasized the importance of proper training and specialized equipment for snake removals involving highly venomous species. It was March 8, 2014, in Polk County, Florida. The small reptile education facility occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of a rural community, surrounded by palmetto scrub and pine flatwoods. Marin Ibarra was 23 years old, a graduate student studying herpetology at a nearby institution. She had been volunteering at the facility for 7 months as part of her research on captive reptile behavior. Marin had handled non-venomous snakes extensively, but had limited direct experience with venomous species. She was responsible for feeding, cleaning enclosures, and assisting with educational presentations. On this particular day, she arrived at 4:30 p.m. for the evening feeding routine. The facility's monocled cobra, a 6-foot male, was scheduled for feeding that afternoon. The feeding protocol specified using long feeding tongs, maintaining a minimum distance of 3 feet, and never opening the enclosure door more than necessary. The facility director was off-site that afternoon. Marin was alone in the building with one other volunteer who was working in a different room. As Marin approached the cobra's enclosure, she noticed the snake positioned near the front glass, head raised and alert, a posture she had seen before during feeding time. Monocled cobras typically reach 4 to 6 feet in length and weigh 3 to 6 pounds. Their neurotoxic venom blocks nerve signals at neuromuscular junctions, preventing muscle contraction and causing respiratory failure. In captivity, they become conditioned to feeding routines and may strike at any movement near the enclosure opening. They are highly defensive and will strike repeatedly when threatened. Their strike range is approximately 1/3 to 1/2 their body length. Marin stood in front of the glass-fronted terrarium with a sliding panel on the right side. She opened the door about 10 inches, enough to insert the feeding tongs. Holding the rat with the tongs in her right hand, she began maneuvering it through the opening. The cobra, already alert, oriented toward the movement. As she extended the tongs, the rat slipped and fell about 18 inches inside the enclosure. Marin instinctively reached forward to retrieve it. The cobra struck at the rat, but missed. As she pulled back, the tongs caught on the sliding door, and the cobra struck again, this time hitting her left hand near the opening. The cobra's fangs penetrated just below the knuckles, between her index and middle fingers. The bite lasted about 3 seconds, partly because she instinctively pulled back, embedding the fangs more deeply. She jerked her hand free, leaving deep puncture wounds. The cobra withdrew into the enclosure, hood still flared. Marin stumbled backward, dropping the tongs, and immediately noticed blood and a burning sensation. The other volunteer, 2 rooms away, heard her cry out and arrived within 15 seconds. 2 fang punctures were visible, spaced about 0.5 inches apart, with moderate bleeding and mild swelling. Marin reported intense pain up her arm and tingling in her lips and tongue. Within 12 minutes, she had difficulty swallowing and focusing her vision. By 18 minutes, early respiratory distress was evident. The volunteer called for emergency assistance and helped Marin to a chair, keeping her calm and still to slow venom absorption. Maren remained conscious for about 20 minutes after the bite, during which she experienced progressive weakness and trouble breathing. Emergency responders arrived 14 minutes later. Maren was conscious but in severe distress, with labored breathing and visible muscle weakness. Her left hand and forearm were swollen, and she could not move her fingers. Oxygen was administered, and she was transported immediately. During the 22-minute drive to the nearest facility equipped for envenomation, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She lost consciousness, and her breathing became increasingly shallow. Upon arrival, staff began administering antivenom and providing respiratory support. Despite aggressive treatment, her neurological symptoms progressed, leading to complete respiratory paralysis, requiring full mechanical ventilation. Maren's condition remained critical as medical staff continued supportive care and antivenom administration. Maren died approximately 2 hours and 48 minutes after the bite. The cause of death was respiratory failure secondary to neurotoxic envenomation. The medical examiner noted that the bite had delivered a substantial venom load through a sustained, deep envenomation. The combination of prolonged fang penetration, hand position near the enclosure opening, and the delay in accessing specialized treatment in a rural location significantly reduced survival chances. Investigators found that, while the facility had proper equipment and protocols, there was no requirement for two-person teams during venomous snake feeding, and no antivenom was kept on site due to cost and storage concerns. Following the incident, the facility implemented new safety measures, mandatory two-person protocols for all venomous snake handling, on-site antivenom storage for the most dangerous species, and additional training requirements for volunteers. The monocled cobra remained in the collection, but was reclassified as display only, with no volunteer interaction permitted. It was June 10th, 2017, the sun already climbing high over the colonial hacienda in Oaxaca, Mexico, where 50 wedding guests gathered in the garden to celebrate. By noon, this event would be transformed into a medical emergency that rural infrastructure was not equipped to handle. Tobias Rivera was 34 years old, the eldest of 3 brothers and fiercely protective of his younger siblings. He worked as a delivery driver in Mexico City, a job that kept him away from family for weeks at a time. His reputation at family gatherings was well established. He drank heavily, usually mezcal, and his behavior became increasingly reckless as the night wore on. His mother often joked, with thinly veiled concern, that Tobias would either fight someone or injure himself before any celebration ended. That morning, Tobias had arrived at the hacienda 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He had already consumed several glasses of mezcal by 10 a.m., greeting relatives with loud embraces and exaggerated stories. His younger brother, the groom, had asked him twice to slow down on the drinking, to no avail. Around 11:30 a.m., as guests milled around the garden waiting for the ceremony to begin, Tobias spotted movement in the shrubs. The snake, approximately 5 feet long with distinctive brown and tan patterns, had been disturbed by foot traffic and was likely attempting to relocate to quieter territory. The fer de lance, known locally as Barba amarilla, is among the most dangerous snakes in Central America. Adults are typically about 4 to 6 feet long, though very large females can exceed 8 feet, and specimens may weigh up to about 13 pounds. These pit vipers possess hemotoxic venom that attacks blood cells and tissue. A single bite can deliver enough venom to cause catastrophic internal bleeding, with symptoms progressing rapidly. Tobias pointed it out to several bridesmaids standing nearby, laughing at their nervous reactions. One of the hacienda staff, a maid named Rosa, who was refilling water pitchers, saw what he was looking at and immediately warned him to stay away from it. She explained in Spanish that it was extremely dangerous and that he should alert the groundskeeper. Tobias dismissed her concern with a wave, his judgment severely impaired by alcohol. Tobias approached the snake with exaggerated stealth, crouching low and making theatrical gestures to the watching crowd. The snake coiled tighter, raising its head in a defensive posture. He reached down and grabbed the snake behind its head, but his grip was imprecise and likely weakened by intoxication. The fer-de-lance twisted with surprising strength, its body whipping around his forearm. The strike happened in less than a second. The snake's head jerked forward, and its fangs punctured the back of Tobias's right hand between the thumb and index finger, embedding fully before retracting. The venom, injected deep into muscle tissue, began its work immediately. Tobias's face transformed from drunken amusement to shock. He screamed and flung the snake away, watching it disappear back into the shrubs. Tobias clutched his hand, staring at the 2 puncture wounds. He staggered toward a stone bench where his brother and several guests rushed to support him. The groom held Tobias in a seated position, while his uncle kept the arm immobilized, removed rings and watches, and instructed someone to call for an ambulance. Bystanders were careful not to tighten anything into a tourniquet or cut the skin. The bite site began to swell noticeably. The pain intensified, described by envenomation victims as burning combined with crushing pressure. Dark bruising crept up from his wrist as blood vessels ruptured beneath the surface. He felt dizzy and briefly confused before his speech slurred. Blood began seeping from his gums, a sign that the venom was destroying his blood's ability to clot. By 30 minutes post-bite, Tobias was struggling to remain upright, his breathing shallow and rapid. Rosa called emergency services immediately, but the nearest hospital with antivenin was 56 miles away in Oaxaca City, over rural roads, with a minimum 40-minute response. Tobias's arm swelled to nearly twice its size, skin black and purple, and he vomited blood-tinged fluid onto his white wedding shirt as his blood pressure dropped from accelerating internal hemorrhage. The ambulance arrived 43 minutes after the initial call. Paramedics immediately started an IV line and administered pain medication. During transport, Tobias remained conscious, but increasingly unresponsive. His entire arm had become grotesquely swollen, and bleeding from his mouth and nose indicated widespread vascular damage. He arrived at the hospital approximately 70 minutes after the bite. Medical staff administered polyvalent antivenin, but the delay had allowed extensive tissue damage and internal bleeding to progress. Despite aggressive treatment, Tobias suffered cardiac arrest and died at 1:47 p.m. The wedding was canceled, and most guests departed that afternoon in stunned silence. Tobias's family held a quiet funeral 3 days later in Oaxaca, attended only by immediate relatives.